Hello everyone. I made a video yesterday about Shota versus Hyuga, and I actually really liked doing it, and a lot of people gave me a reasonable feedback for it, so I thought that maybe I would do it again. The match that I'm gonna review today is a match between one of my countrymen, Andre Strasky, and probably the best player ever, or at least right now. He's definitely in the conversation, right? Paulo Rosa. I'm gonna talk about one specific game. It's actually very similar to the match that I talked about yesterday. It's a game four. Paulo is 2-1. He's ahead, and once again, I think he could have won. Uh, the one specific play I'm gonna talk about, like the turn where I think he made a mistake. Like I'm not sure he made a mistake. Like I think if he did what I think was right, he would have won. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was the right play. But at least I want to talk about it. I think it's interesting. When I was watching the game, I thought that he made a mistake, but it's possible. Like he obviously didn't know Andre's hand, and it's possible that there is like some other combination of cards that he would have lost to had he done it the other way. But let's get into the match. Oh, I guess we should look at the deck list because they actually didn't play the exact same deck list. They tested together, I think, but their list is a little bit different. So like, let's take a look at the differences. So the difference is that Andre is actually only playing 3 Wicked Wolves and 3 Nisas, and he has an extra land and 2 Gusts. Yeah, whereas Paulo has extra Borover, he plays 1 less land, and he plays 4 of Nisa and Wicked Wolf. Obviously, don't know what's better, but it's not really that important for this match. Also, one thing to note is that sideboarding in this kind of a matchup is very interesting because a lot of the cards, uh, their power fluctuates depending on what your opponent does, right? For example, Questing Beast, you usually want to board it out in the mirror because it's bad against Wicked Wolf, but as we've seen throughout the match, both players actually took out Wicked Wolf, or they didn't draw it, which is like pretty unlikely because they drew a bunch of cards which are like races and stuff. And if that's the case, Questing Beast actually becomes awesome because you can pressure Oko, Nisa and stuff. And Paulo actually brought Questing Beast back for the last game where he drew it. It was really good, but he mulliganed to 5, so it didn't end up being good enough. But you know, another thing that like it really depends is like, for example, Veil of Summer. When I also played the Pro Tour, and like in my testing, I was like always bringing them in like the Sultai mirrors or even against blue green. But as I was playing more and more, I started to like not be so sure about it because like what are you gonna board out instead of it, right? Like obviously when your opponent has like a Noxious Grasp, then it seems insane to have the whale, or when they have the mass manipulation or whatever. But then there are games where you just have like a mana creature heavy draw, and you draw the whale instead of an action card, and it's like pretty awful. So I'm not entirely sure how the players sideboard it. I actually talked to Andre briefly about it, and he said that weirdly enough, they weren't boarding whale in against Sultai, but they were bringing in one against blue green. I guess the mass manipulation was just so brutal that you bring one in, and it ends up like really mattering in this game. But it's a classic kind of a dance where you just kind of have to think about what your opponent is going to do, which cards he showed you in the previous game and stuff. So let's get into the game. So Andre starts with Once Upon a Time. He's thinking for a while, but in the end I think he has a choice between an island and forest. That's why he's thinking. Uh, Paulo gives him a nod after he reveals the forest because it's kind of obvious that he was thinking about that. And then he plays a Scryland. Maybe you would think that playing Scryland before Once Upon a Time is better because you can like hit a better target, but that's actually a wrong play because seeing the extra card is not that likely to matter. But after you cast the Once Upon a Time, the actual Scry might be like very impactful. So it's better to do it this way, obviously. Unfortunately, the way coverage works, we can actually see the top card, so like I have no idea what he's thinking about. both players have a pretty reasonable draw. It's good that like none of them has this draw of like Gilded Goose into Oak or whatever, and he just like runs off with the game. That's how this matchup played out. It was like super complicated and grindy some games, and some games like one player just like snowballs with an Oko or Nisa and just destroys the other player. But this is not one of the games. So Andre, the screen says that he has two Paradise Druids in his hand, but that's actually wrong. He already played one of those and it's just not updated. The reason why he like I think it's like obvious he's not gonna attack into the druid because he has Crisis for 4 next turn, but if you think for a while, it means that maybe you are thinking about playing another Paradise Druid and then you decided to keep up Gust or something. It's definitely better to wait, just to like not give away info. So what's really interesting about this game is that Andre has a turn for Crisis, which is like insane against Paulo's draw of like a Borover and Gust. Like if he had like a Nisa or some other expensive green card, these temple spells would be insane, but they're actually pretty bad against Gust. So what Paulo decides to do is that he's just gonna play a tempo game, at least for this part of the game, and just cast, or I think he ends up playing Borover here, the Crisis, and then he tries to leverage his Planeswalker to kill Andre before he can get his card advantage back. But what's this will actually end up being really important throughout the game. I will talk about it a little bit later. So he bounces it. Obviously, it's better to bounce it instead of playing Gust because you can use Gust against like an Oko or Nisa uh, down the path, and he has the perfect combination here, right? He can play Nisa untap Breeding Pool and have Gust up. So like when I was watching this game, I was like, wow, this is over. Like Andre had the perfect card, but it doesn't actually really matter because Nisa is just so powerful, right? And Paulo even has his own Crisis in his hand. Unfortunately, he doesn't have like he has Temple of Mystery instead of like another Breeding Pool or Forest, so he doesn't actually have that much mana. So Andre is in a tough spot here. He's thinking about what to do. He has a Godwig in hand, which will end up being really important. So let's see. I actually don't remember what he played this turn. His hand is Godwig, Oko, and Crisis. So I guess he's thinking between Godwig and Crisis. I'm I'm actually not sure if playing Crisis here is better than playing Godwig because of specifically Ethergast. Also, Paulo was thinking last turn a little bit, so that kind of, not necessarily, but it makes the fact that he has Gust more likely, and like Godwig couldn't get Gusted. I'm not really sure what would be better, but maybe Andre was thinking that like he needs an actual block. He's like so far behind that he needs a blocker for this free freeze, and just hope that Paulo doesn't have a Gust. So like right now, Andre is probably thinking, well, I'm just dead, and this is the key turn of the match. So I'm gonna pause here. So I would like to pause it at a time where we can see Paulo's hand. His hand is Crisis and 2 Okos. So in most cases, when you untap with Nissa, it's just obvious that you're gonna play Crisis because usually the card advantage that you gain from it is just like too much for your opponent to handle, and you want to use the opportunity to do that. Like Andre plays his own like Gust and Brazen Borovers or whatever, like he can get rid of Nissa and you might potentially lose the window to play a huge Crisis. But what's different about this game is that Paulo already used 2 of his cards to use Tempo against Crisis. So even if he plays a big Crisis of his own, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's gonna win the the grindy war, right? Andre has like infinite cards in his hand. So like Paulo's advantage in this game is the tempo, right? So what he ends up doing, let's just take a look at what he ends up doing. So he's doing the math whether to just like attack for a bunch or play creases, but in the end he just can't resist to play the creases, which I think is wrong. I'm gonna talk about it after he does it. It's gonna be more obvious after what happens. So he attacks for free. So it looks really good for him right now, right? He has Nisa. He's gonna draw a bunch of cards with creases, and if he draws any land or a 2 mana card, he basically just won. Because if he draws a land, he can follow it up with Oko, and then that's just like too many permanents to have. Or if he draws like a 2 mana card like a Borrower or Gust, that's also probably gonna be good enough. But what ends up happening is that he draws the worst possible combination of cards, which is he doesn't draw any land and he doesn't draw anything to cast. And he didn't actually draw like that many cards. I think this is wrong because he's basically, by doing this, he's fighting Andre on the axis that he doesn't want to fight him. Andre has infinite cards. He already drew 4 extra cards with Graces. And even though it looks really good for him right now, like you're just like fighting the war that you don't really want to fight. let's just rewind a little bit. So Paulo's hand is 2 Okos and a Crisis. So if he plays an Oko here, he plays an Oko, makes a 6/6 from the breeding pool. He untaps a forest, then he can play another Oko. Makes another 6/6 and attacks for 14. And then Paulo is at 7, facing down Nisa, 2 6/6s that are both tapped, Oko, and 2 Paradise. Like, how is Andre gonna win from that position? I was like thinking about it. Like, if he has mass manipulation, he can 2, 4. Yeah, if he has a land plus manipulation, he can like steal Nisa. He can't really steal the 6/6 because he's gonna be tapped. So he can like steal the Nisa and an Oko and like untap a land and then maybe have like a Gust. But isn't he just like dead anyway? He's yeah, even if he has the manipulation, steals Nisa, he untaps the land, and like he would need to have a breeding pool, I guess. That would mean that he would go to 5. Like, I just don't really see combination of cards that Andre can like. I'm not sure about this. Maybe there is some combination of like bunch of Gusts or Borrowers or whatever to survive. But I just like, so yeah, he plays the Oko, makes a 6/6, untaps the forest, uses both Paradise Druids and the land to play another Oko, makes another 6/6, attacks for 12. Andre is at 9, facing down 2 6/6s, Oko, Nisa, and 2 Paradise Druids. Yeah, like what can Andre do? Like, if he doesn't have the manipulation, then he's not getting rid of Nisa and Oko that is in play. He definitely can't like kill them, so he like needs to have something else. And if that's something else, aren't you in a great position? You still have the Crisis and Borrower. Like, how are you gonna lose? So I just wanted to point it out. Not necessarily that I think it's a mistake, but I would maybe like to hear people's opinion about this. Because I thought it was interesting. Like, the problem with this is that like Paulo is obviously an insane player. So after the match, when I said on Twitter that I think he should have won, people were like, yeah, who are you to say, like, or whatever. But just because you're great doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes, or it's the finals of the Mythic Championship, so you can be nervous, make a mistake or whatever, and just playing Crisis is super tempting here. Like, I understand that he got probably super unlucky because he didn't drew the land or Gust or Borrower, and Andre then had like the perfect cards to come back and win. But I just thought it was interesting. So let's see how the game plays out. I guess I can put it back to the crisis point. Yeah, so he played a crisis and he drew another Oko, once upon a time, and a crisis. So like cards that don't do anything basically. He already had a bunch of those, so he basically didn't draw anything. So instead of just like putting Oko in play and just put the maximum amount of pressure, he just put a 6/6 into play instead. And now Andre has the perfect card, the card that Paulo doesn't want to see in the spot, which is Godwig. The reason why Godwig is so good here is because Andre has also has an Ether Gust, which he needs to deal with the Nisa. And the way Godwig works is that it also, when you play a blue spell, it taps something, so you can tap the Crisis. Andre hand is like super bad here, so like when I saw this, I thought it was maybe potentially a mistake, but I was still like sure that Andre is gonna lose, right? Like just like look at the board. So yeah, Andre plays a Godwig. It's taking him a while. He just doesn't really want to mess up. Why did he play the breeding pool? He shocked with a breeding pool for some reason. Maybe it's because of Nisa. Like he's maybe thinking that he will need all forests possible, and he just didn't want to play castle instead. Oh, another thing that I noticed last turn is that if you're gonna play the crisis, maybe it was better to like what Paulo did was he attacked for free and then he played a crisis, keeping these Paradise Druids untapped. Uh, it's maybe possible that it was better to play it pre-combat, and then if this happens, you don't draw anything, then you can attack for 4. But maybe you don't want to do it because of Wicked Wolf anyway. But if he has Wicked Wolf, are you kind of winning anyway? Like I'm not sure. They also probably know that they're gonna board out Wicked Wolves, so maybe that was a mistake. It doesn't really matter. It's just like 1 extra damage, and Paulo drew once upon a time, so like it didn't matter. But you know, potentially a small mistake. So Andre is thinking about what to discard. It's actually like you might think that it doesn't really matter because he has so many cards, but it actually does because you have like Nisas and stuff. So even like thinking about which lands you want to keep and stuff might end up mattering. Like, oh, interestingly, Paulo could have actually played. I think he didn't play a land, right? So he could have like once upon a time on his turn to play a land drop. So I guess he's like really worried about Wicked Wolf. He just doesn't want to tap those Paradise Ruins, which I think makes sense in most scenarios. But are you really worried about Wicked Wolf? Like Andre didn't have food, so like he would need to play like a goose into a Wicked Wolf. He definitely didn't have the goose like bunch of turns before. I know he drew a lot of cards meanwhile, but he still needs to have the goose and wolf, and then he needs to have the gust. And even if he does, if he has that, are you really that worried about that? And also, I really think you want to hit your land drop. Not to mention that when you once upon a time end of turn, Andre can like Ether Gust the Nisa in response and get rid of it permanently. Like maybe Paulo doesn't care about it. Andre doesn't end up doing that because he does have the Godwig and he wants to use Ether Gust on Paulo's turn to tap his creature. But like, how do you know that that's the exact sequence that's going to happen? So you know, it's just like another point that might have been wrong potentially. Yeah, and now Paulo is starting to get kind of screwed because he's not necessarily winning the long game battle. Andre has more mana, and he drew a bunch of cards before. So even though Paulo seemed to be super far ahead with like Nisa and Crisis, it's actually not necessarily the case. And you can see at Paulo that he's like, oh shit, like I thought I had this, and like suddenly he played a Godwig into Gust, and it's not looking that obvious right now. Like, I still think that he was thinking that he's gonna win at this point, but you can definitely see that he doesn't look as comfortable as he did a second ago. So Paulo is thinking whether he wants to keep the Nisa or not. Interestingly enough, he puts it on the... Okay, he puts it on the top. I would be really surprised if he didn't. Because it's not necessarily free, but it's like kind of free because, you know, the turn you play it, it immediately untaps a land that gives you 2 extra mana, so it just costs only 3, and then overall it seems like a better draw than a random card, so... So Paulo has another crisis, but once again, like in regular games, this is usually good enough. Like the power of crisis is just like too much to overcome for your opponent. But Andre already drew like bunch of cards with Cadwick and crises. And also, funnily enough, Andre just top decked his one of Whale Summer. I talked to him, so I know that he had only one, which ends up winning him the game because Paulo draws a mass manipulation and Andre has the whale, and that just basically swings the game. I remember that, you know, after the match I talked to a bunch of people and I said, well, I think Paulo messed up, and they thought that I was talking about him playing the mass manipulation into the whale, which I wasn't talking about at all. I think he was kind of forced to do that at that point. Like, the game wasn't looking that great for him. He didn't have that many great options, and it's not unlikely necessarily that Andre has the whale, and if he doesn't, he just like wins in a spot instead of just like fighting fight that like he might win. So I think it just makes sense to do it. So I don't think that was a mistake. And yeah, this is the turn where everything swings, because Andre now has like all the cards in his hand that he was accumulating during the previous turns. He has a lot of mana, and he has a Nisa advantage now. And as you know, when both players have like infinite cards, the player with more mana is going to win. Andre just like making sure to not mess up here. Yeah. So a funny thing happens here. He actually makes an elk from the crisis. Normally you don't really want to do that because just like making it even a bigger creature just seems awful. But Andre knows that if he untaps with these Planeswalkers, he's just gonna win. And he doesn't really mind. He doesn't really mind jumping with like his Druid or Gilded Goose to protect the Planeswalkers. So it obviously makes sense to do that. One interesting point during the game that I didn't mention was that when Paulo gusted Andre's first crisis, Andre actually ended up actually, no. The first crisis he borrowed, and then he gust the crisis, and Andre ended up putting it on the bottom. I just want to talk about it briefly. So I don't know what's right, but like Andre put it on the bottom, and the reason is that I think that he thought that he was like really far behind, and he's drawing so many extra cards that like crisis doesn't really matter. That's like not what he's looking for, and he needs to find a specific card, which makes sense. But I actually see this quite often, that like you're in like a dire position, and you're like looking for something specific, and you're like, for example, Scry or something, and it's not the card that you're looking for, and everyone always puts it on the bottom, or like a lot of people do in a lot of cases, and that's not necessarily right, because just because you like deal with a certain threat or you get out of a certain position doesn't mean that you won the game. You also have to think down the path. So you have to really think about like, do you really need to draw that card on that specific turn or whatever? Like, is even though with the card that you see on the top, or with Gus you're like deciding whether you put it on the top or bottom, is it important for that specific turn or like in the near future? Down the line you might be better off by having that card, and it just might be better to keep it on the top even though it doesn't look great at that point. Like, I'm not sure if Andre made a mistake. I think if I actually think that if he topped it, he would have lost because he drew well on this turn, and you know it would be the next card if he had the crisis in his hand. So cheers to him, I suppose. I'm just saying that I'm not necessarily sure it was right, but so yeah, and now we're in the I just think he had to cast the mass manipulation. Like his position isn't really that good. Like what is he gonna do? Like he can play like Nisa plus Oko, but he's not gonna kill Andre's planeswalkers and then he just untaps. Maybe it would be end up being better and the game would go for a while and maybe he would have won. I'm not sure, but he doesn't know Andre's hand, and if he doesn't have the whale, he just wins with a mass manipulation, right? So I think it's fine. I don't blame him for doing that. Maybe if he didn't, he would still win this game. Like I don't know. He still has Crisis in hand, so maybe if he plays like an Isa plus whatever, like But like Andre has like 3 or 4 cards in his hand, and if he has anything, he can like kill those, planeswalkers and stuff. So I think it makes sense. Yeah, and I think we can stop here. Now Andre just wailed him. He drew under action card, and now he untaps with an Oko and Isa and wins. The game is gonna continue for a while because obviously it's the finals of the Pro Tour, and you're not gonna scoop. But yeah. So I thought it was interesting if I missed something. Like for example, when I was making the video yesterday, I said that Shoda made a mistake because he searched for an island instead of a duel. Because I didn't realize that he had 2 flooded groves and he actually needed the island to cast his Snapcaster. So it's definitely possible that I missed something. Maybe Paulo didn't make a mistake and I'm just, missing something. So just any kind of a feedback would be nice. And yeah, usually when 2 really good players, like, both, Andre was an MPL at that point, but he was like platinum 2 times before and he top 82 Pro Tours. Like when 2 really good players play against each other, it's not really that in all the games the player who outplayed the other player won. Like oftentimes one player just snowballs or like the plays are forced. Like there are really not really that many interesting decisions that maybe swung the game. And in these like super close matches, usually there is like one game that stands out that maybe if the player played better or did something differently, he would have won. And I just wanted to focus on that in this video. So yeah, that will be all for today. I will be back soonish, I suppose. Bye.